No one at the Galactic Council expected the humans to say yes. For 300 years, the war had burned across the outer systems like a sickness that would not die. Whole trade routes had vanished. Colony moons had gone dark. Ancient alliances had broken apart under fear, hunger, and revenge. Every major power in the galaxy had already lost too much. So when the Council finally sent an invitation to Earth, many believed it was only a political act, a symbol, a desperate message to show the people that someone, somewhere, still had a plan. Humans had stayed away from galactic wars for generations. They traded, they explored, they watched, and that silence made everyone nervous. On the day of the invitation, the council hall was colder than usual. Ambassador Relena the Vari stood beneath the great glass dome and read the message aloud, her voice shaking only once. By emergency decree, the Galactic Council requests military partnership with the Human Systems Union. The chamber fell silent. Some looked relieved. Some looked afraid. Far away, on Earth's orbital ring, the message arrived in a quiet room where Admiral Elias Vance stood alone, staring at the stars beyond the glass. He read the invitation only once. Then he gave a small, unreadable smile. Behind him, one of his officers spoke carefully. "Sir, if we enter this war, there may be no turning back." Vance kept his eyes on the stars. "They know that," he said. "But do they know us?" 12 hours later, the Council received humanity's answer. It was only 4 words long. "We accept your invitation." Across the galaxy, markets crashed. Border worlds panicked. Military networks lit up with warnings. Even species far from the front lines began moving their fleets. Not because humans had joined the war, but because the oldest powers in the galaxy remembered something the younger races did not. The last time humans had entered a galactic war, entire star maps had been rewritten. And this time, humanity was not being attacked. This time, they had been invited to be continued. The news spread across the galaxy faster than any ship could travel. Humanity had entered the war. For many younger civilizations, the reaction was confusion. Humans were known mostly as traders, engineers, and explorers. They built powerful engines, mapped dangerous star routes, and sold advanced navigation systems to almost every species. But they were not famous for war. At least, not in the last 300 years. Older civilizations remembered things differently. On the desert world of Deros, an elderly Vari historian watched the news with trembling hands. When the announcement ended, he slowly closed his eyes. "They should never have invited them," he whispered. His student looked confused. "But, Master, humans are allies now." The old Vari shook his head. "Young one, allies could be more dangerous than enemies." Far away from Deros, the heart of the war burned inside the Oridan sector. 3 powerful empires fought there. The Creel Dominion, a brutal expansionist species known for destroying colonies that resisted them. The Valoran Assembly, a coalition of advanced civilizations trying to stop the Dominion's spread. And the neutral border worlds, hundreds of small systems caught in the middle of the conflict. For decades, the Valoran Assembly had slowly been losing ground. The Creel were relentless. They did not negotiate. They did not surrender. They simply conquered. Entire planets had already fallen. That was why the Council had turned to humanity. Desperation made strange decisions. Inside the massive Valoran command station, located near the front lines, the War Council gathered around a holographic star map. The map showed dozens of blinking red markers. Each one represented a battle. Each one represented lives. General Tarvek, the Valoran military leader, looked exhausted as he studied the map. "The Creel fleet is advancing toward the Torin Gate," he said quietly. One of the officers frowned. "If they capture Torin, they will control the entire sector." Tarvek nodded. "And the Council believes the humans can stop them." A low murmur spread across the room. Some officers were hopeful. Others were skeptical. One younger commander finally spoke. "With respect, General, humans have not fought a galactic war in centuries. How can we rely on them now?" Before Tarvek could answer, a new signal appeared on the map. A small blue symbol blinked near the edge of the sector. Then another, and another. An officer quickly leaned toward the console. "General, we are receiving multiple warp signatures." Tarvek stepped closer. How many? The officer swallowed. Unknown. The sensors are struggling to count them. The holographic map slowly filled with blue lights. Dozens. Then hundreds. Ships were arriving. Human ships. But something about the readings made the room uneasy. These were not large war fleets like those used by the Valoran or Creel. Instead, the human ships were different. Some were enormous carriers. Some were long and narrow exploration vessels. Some were strange modular structures that did not match any known warship design. It looked less like an invasion fleet and more like a traveling civilization. General Tarvek narrowed his eyes. Open communication channel. Moments later, the face of a human officer appeared above the table. It was Admiral Elias Vance. He looked calm, almost relaxed. General Tarvek, Vance said politely. Tarvek nodded. Admiral, welcome to the Oridan sector. For a moment, both leaders studied each other. Two very different civilizations. Two very different histories. Finally, Tarvek spoke. The Creel Dominion has nearly 2,000 warships in this sector alone. He pointed at the red lights on the map. They're advancing toward Torrengate. If they break through, the Valoran Assembly will lose the entire frontier. Admiral Vance listened without interrupting. When Tarvek finished, Vance simply nodded. We understand. The Valoran officers waited for more, but none came. Tarvek frowned slightly. You seem calm about the situation. Vance gave a small smile. General, humans prefer to understand a battlefield before acting. Another Valoran officer leaned forward. Admiral, with respect, we do not have time for slow strategies. The Creel will reach Torren in less than 4 days. The human admiral remained calm. That will not happen. The room went quiet. Tarvek studied the human carefully. You sound very confident. Vance folded his hands behind his back. Because we are not here to fight this war the way you've been fighting it. The officers exchanged uncertain looks. What does that mean? One of them asked. Vance turned slightly. Behind him, a large window showed dozens of human ships moving silently through space. For 300 years, Vance said slowly, humanity watched the galaxy. We studied your wars, your strategies, your technologies, your mistakes. The Valoran officers leaned closer to the table. Admiral Vance continued, you see war as fleets meeting fleets. Power against power. Victory through destruction. Tarvek crosses arms. And humans do not? Vance shook his head. Humans see war as a system. A network of decisions, supply lines, information, fear, and time. He pointed at the holographic map. Destroying enemy ships is only one way to win. Sometimes it is not even the best way. The Valoran commanders looked puzzled. One of them finally asked the obvious question. If you are not planning to destroy the Creel fleet, then what are you planning to do? Admiral Vance smiled again, but this time the smile felt colder. First, we will let them believe nothing has changed. Tarvek frowned. What? The Creel expect a large battle at Torrengate, Vance explained. They believe we will gather all fleets there and attempt to stop them. That is what your forces would normally do. The Valoran officers slowly nodded. Yes, Tarvek admitted. That is correct. But humans rarely fight the battle the enemy expects, Vance said. He tapped a command on his console. The holographic map suddenly zoomed out. New data appeared. Supply routes, mining stations, fuel depots, communication relays. Hundreds of small symbols filled the map. The Valoran officers stared in surprise. These are Creel logistical systems, Vance said calmly. Tarvek blinked. How did you obtain this information? Human exploration ships have been mapping this region for over a century. The room went silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, one officer whispered the question everyone was thinking. You already knew everything about this battlefield before joining the war? Vance simply nodded. Yes. General Tarvek slowly realized something unsettling. Humanity had not rushed into the war blindly. They had already been studying it for decades. And now they had entered at the exact moment when the Valoran assembly was about to collapse. Tarvek leaned forward. What are you planning, Admiral? Vance looked at the map again. Then he spoke quietly. The Creel Dominion believes war is about overwhelming force. But force needs fuel. Ships need supplies. Commanders need communication. And soldiers need hope. The hologram shifted again. Dozens of small blue human ships separated from the main fleet and began moving toward different star systems, not toward the front lines, but deeper into Creel territory. Tarvek stared. You are not attacking their fleet. No, Vance said calmly. We are attacking their war. The Valoran commanders slowly began to understand. And for the first time that day, General Tarvek felt something unexpected. Hope. But at that exact moment, an emergency signal suddenly flashed across the room. One of the sensor officers shouted, General, massive Creel fleet movement detected. The hologram shifted again. More red lights appeared. Hundreds of them. The Creel had noticed the human arrival, and they were accelerating their attack. Tarvek looked back at Admiral Vance. The Creel fleet will reach Torin Gate in less than 70 hours now. Vance did not look worried. Instead, he asked a quiet question. General, how long does the Creel fleet normally operate before needing to resupply? Tarvek answered automatically. About 6 days. Vance nodded slowly. Then he said something that made the entire room go silent. Good. Because in 6 days, the Creel Dominion will discover something very unpleasant. Tarvek narrowed his eyes. What exactly? Admiral Vance looked directly at the camera. And for the first time, there was no smile. Every supply depot they depend on will already be gone. The room fell into stunned silence. But far away, deep inside Creel territory, the first human stealth ships were already approaching their targets. And the Creel Dominion had absolutely no idea. To be continued. Deep inside Creel Dominion space, the stars looked calm. Nothing about the quiet system suggested that a war was about to change. The Creel Empire had always believed their territory was secure. Their borders were protected by patrol fleets and powerful sensor grids. No enemy fleet had ever managed to travel this deep without being detected, but the ships moving through the darkness now were not normal warships. They were human vessels. Small, silent, invisible to most standard scanners. One of those ships was a Horizon Scout, a narrow human stealth cruiser drifting between 2 dead moons. Inside the ship, Commander Lena Ortiz watched a holographic map that showed the Creel supply network. Hundreds of red icons filled the map. Fuel depots, cargo stations, communication hubs. The invisible skeleton that kept the Creel war machine alive. Around her, the crew worked quietly. No one raised their voice. No one rushed. Human operations were always calm. Commander, said the navigation officer softly. We have reached the first target system. Ortiz nodded. Status of the depot? The sensor officer responded immediately. Creel fuel station confirmed. 2 defense satellites. 1 patrol cruiser. Ortiz studied the data. It was not a large base, but it was important. Every Creel fleet moving toward the Torin Gate passed through the station for fuel. Destroying it would not win the war, but it would begin something much bigger. Ortiz tapped command. Prepare infiltration drones. Outside the Horizon Scout, several small pods drifted away from the ship. They moved slowly, almost like pieces of space debris. The Creel sensors did not notice them. Within minutes, the drones reached the fuel station. They attached themselves quietly to the station's outer hull. Inside the human ship, the crew waited. 30 seconds passed. Then the drone operator spoke. Intrusion successful. We have access to the station network. Ortiz gave a small nod. Upload the package. The operator pressed a key. A strange human software program entered the Creel system. It did not destroy anything. Not yet. Instead, it began quietly copying data. Fuel distribution schedules. Fleet supply routes. Communication traffic. Within moments, dozens of other human ships across the sector began receiving the same information. The Creel Empire believed their war network was strong, but now humanity could see every moving part. Ortiz leaned back in her chair. Admiral Vance was right, she said quietly. Once you see the whole system, the war becomes predictable. The drone operator looked at her. Commander orders? Ortiz smiled slightly. Now we begin Phase 2. The operator pressed another key. On the Creel station, a small power fluctuation occurred. Nothing dangerous. Nothing obvious. Just a tiny change inside the station's fuel control systems. But it was enough. The fuel station slowly began sending incorrect data to the Creel fleet network. According to the system logs, everything was working perfectly. But the truth was different. Fuel shipments were now being sent to the wrong locations. Supply ships were changing routes. And the Creel fleet did not know. Meanwhile, hundreds of light years away, the massive Creel War fleet moved through space toward the Torin Gate. Admiral Craven, the brutal commander of the Creel Dominion fleet, stood on the command bridge of his flagship Blood of Conquest. He was a tall creature with dark armored skin and glowing yellow eyes. His species respected only strength, and Craven had spent his entire life proving his strength. A tactical officer approached him. Admiral, human fleets have arrived in the sector. Craven gave a low growl. Yes, I am aware. He looked at the star map. Small blue markers represented human ships. But something about the pattern annoyed him. They were not gathering for battle. They were spreading out. What are they doing? Craven asked. The officer hesitated. We are not certain. Craven slammed his clawed hand on the console. Humans are unpredictable. I do not trust them. Another officer spoke carefully. Our sensors show no large human fleet near Torin Gate. Craven smiled coldly. Good. That means the Valoran fools still believe they can stop us alone. He turned to the bridge crew. Prepare attack formation. The Torin Gate will fall within 3 days. The Creel officers responded with pride. Victory to the Dominion. Their war fleet continued forward, but none of them noticed something strange happening behind them. Back on the Valoran command station, General Tarvek watched the human fleet movements with growing confusion. Admiral Vance, he said slowly, your ships are spreading across the entire sector. Yes, Vance replied calmly. Tarvek frowned. But the Creel fleet is still approaching Torin Gate. Correct. And you are not sending your forces to stop them. Also correct. The Valoran officers looked nervous. One of them finally said what everyone was thinking. If the Creel reach Torin Gate, they will destroy our defensive fleets. Vance remained calm. That will not happen. Tarvek crossed his arms. You said that before. Yes, but you have not explained why. Admiral Vance looked toward the stars outside his command ship. Then he spoke quietly. Because the Creel fleet will never reach Torin Gate. Tarvek stared at him. How can you be sure? Vance activated a new holographic display. The map showed dozens of Creel supply systems. Then one by one, they began turning dark. Fuel stations offline. Cargo stations disabled. Communication hubs silent. The Valoran officers leaned forward in shock. What is happening? Tarvek asked. Our operations teams are removing the Creel supply network, Vance said. Without supplies, their fleet cannot travel far. But their fleet already left those systems, Tarvek argued. Yes, Vance said calmly. And that is the problem. The Valoran officers slowly realized the danger. The Creel fleet had already begun its attack, but the supply lines behind them were disappearing. Tarvek whispered, They are marching into a trap. Vance nodded. Exactly. The holographic map continued changing. More Creel systems went dark. Fuel shipments vanished. Communication signals became confused. And slowly, the massive Creel fleet began to lose coordination. But something unexpected was about to happen. Inside the Creel flagship, Admiral Craven studied his console. His eyes narrowed. Why are our supply ships delayed? The logistics officer looked nervous. Admiral, we are receiving conflicting reports. Craven growled. Explain. Some fuel depots are reporting system failures. Others say they never received scheduled shipments. Craven's claws dug into the metal railing. That is impossible. The officer swallowed. Admiral, we may be experiencing network sabotage. Craven's eyes widened. By the Valoran? The officer hesitated. No, the attack pattern is different. Craven slowly turned toward the star map. Then he understood. Humans. The word came out like poison. For the first time, the Creel warlord realized something terrifying. The humans were not trying to defeat his fleet in battle. They were destroying the war around it. Craven roared with anger. Send orders to all fleets. Secure every supply route immediately. But it was already too late. Across the sector, human ships continued their quiet mission. They did not fire massive weapons. They did not launch huge fleets. Instead, they simply removed the foundations of the Creel war machine. Fuel, information, coordination. The Creel Dominion had entered the war with overwhelming force. But humanity had turned the battlefield into something else entirely. A system that was slowly collapsing. And Admiral Vance knew something the Creel did not. The real crisis had not started yet, because soon the Creel fleet would realize something even worse. They were not just losing their supply lines. They were also being watched. Every movement, every message, every decision. Human intelligence networks now controlled the entire battlefield, and humanity had been preparing for this moment for over a century. The war had only just begun, to be continued. The Creel fleet continued moving toward the Torren Gate, but something had changed. Inside the massive command bridge of the Blood of Conquest, Admiral Craven stared at the tactical screen with growing anger. For hours, the reports had been getting worse. Fuel shipments delayed, supply stations offline, communication relays silent. At first, Craven believed it was a technical failure, but the pattern was too perfect, too precise. Someone was dismantling the Creel war network piece by piece, and every report pointed to the same enemy. Humans. Craven slammed his fist against the command console. Find them, he growled. Every human ship in this sector must be destroyed. A tactical officer spoke nervously. Admiral, their ships are extremely difficult to track. They appear, complete an operation, and disappear again. Craven's eyes burned with rage. Then expand the sensor net. I want every star system scanned. Another officer quickly responded. Yes, Admiral. But even as the Creel tried to track them, human ships continued moving through their territory like shadows. Far away, inside a dark asteroid belt near the Creel border, a small group of human vessels gathered around a silent mining station. Commander Lena Ortiz stood on the bridge of the Horizon Scout, watching the operation unfold. Status update, she asked calmly. A young officer looked up from the console. The mining station power grid is fully under our control. The Creel will not notice the change for at least 4 hours. Ortiz nodded. This station was one of the largest mineral supply centers in the sector. It produced the heavy metals used to repair and maintain Creel warships. Without it, damaged ships will remain damaged. Another officer spoke. Commander, intelligence confirms that the Creel fleet has increased its speed. They are pushing their engines beyond normal limits. Ortiz smiled slightly. They are rushing. Yes. That means the pressure is working. Across the asteroid field, human drones attach themselves quietly to the station's reactors. Unlike traditional explosives, these devices were designed to shut down systems slowly. Power would begin to fail. Life support would struggle. Communication systems would collapse. And within hours, the station would be completely useless. Ortiz turned back to the star map. Send the signal, she ordered. The officer nodded and transmitted a secure message. All across the sector, other human ships received the same command. Phase 3 had begun. Meanwhile, on the Valoran command station, General Tarvek and his officers were watching something incredible unfold. For the first time in decades, the Creel advance had slowed. The massive red fleet on the star map was still moving toward the Torren Gate, but their formation was becoming unstable. Small groups of ships were breaking away. Some were returning to investigate supply problems. Others were reporting fuel shortages. The Creel fleet had lost its perfect coordination. Tarvek looked at Admiral Vance with new respect. I must admit, he said slowly, this strategy is remarkable. Vance stood quietly near the large observation window. The Creel built their empire on speed and aggression, he said. They moved quickly, conquer quickly, and force their enemies to react. Tarvek nodded. That has always been their strength. But strength can become a weakness, Vance replied. Tarvek turned toward him. Explain. Vance activated another holographic display. It showed the Creel fleet formation. They pushed their fleet too far forward, Vance explained. They expected a direct battle. But instead, we removed the infrastructure that supports them. Tarvek studied the map. They are still a powerful fleet. Yes, Vance agreed. But power means nothing if your engines stop. At that moment, a Valoran sensor officer suddenly shouted, General, new reports from the Creel territory. Tarvek turned quickly. What is it? Multiple Creel industrial systems are shutting down. The map filled with warning symbols. Mining stations, repair docks, communication relays, all of them failing. Tarvek looked stunned. How many? The officer hesitated. More than 40 systems so far. Tarvek slowly turned toward Vance. You planned this. Vance nodded calmly. Humans spent a long time studying the galaxy. We learned that wars are rarely won by the strongest weapons. Wars are won by controlling the systems that support those weapons. Tarvek stared at the map. The Creel Dominion had entered the war believing they controlled the battlefield, but now their entire war machine was collapsing, and they could not even see the enemy causing it. Inside the Creel flagship, Admiral Craven received the same reports. His claws tightened around the console. 42 systems offline, he growled. Yes, Admiral, the officer replied nervously. Craven turned toward the star map. His fleet was still moving forward, but the distance to the Tauran Gate was still 2 days away, and now his fleet was running out of time. Another officer approached. Admiral, several ships are reporting fuel shortages. Craven's eyes flashed with anger. That is impossible. Our reserve should last another week. The officer lowered his head. The supply shipments never arrived. Craven finally understood the full danger. The humans had not attacked his fleet. They had cut off everything behind it. He turned to the communication officer. Contact the Dominion High Command. The officer hesitated. Admiral, long-range communications are failing. Craven froze. Failing? Yes. Craven stared at the darkening communication network. The humans had destroyed not just his supplies, but also his connection to the Empire. For the first time in his long career, Admiral Craven felt something he had not felt in years. Uncertainty. He turned slowly toward the navigation officer. How far are we from Tauran Gate? Approximately 42 hours. Craven growled quietly. We continue the attack. But Admiral, the officer said carefully, our fleet may not have enough fuel to return. Craven's eyes burned. We will not return. We will capture the gate. And once the Valoran defenses fall, their supply stations will become ours. The bridge fell silent. The Creel fleet pushed forward again. But this time, the situation was different. They were no longer an unstoppable invasion force. They were a massive army marching deeper into enemy territory, while the ground behind them disappeared. Back on the human command ship, Admiral Vance received the latest intelligence reports. His officers gathered around the map. Admiral, one officer said, the Creel fleet is still advancing. Yes, Vance replied. They are desperate. Another officer spoke. Several Creel ships have begun searching for our operations teams. Vance nodded. That was expected. He looked at the star map. The Creel fleet was now dangerously deep inside the sector. Their supply network was gone. Their communications were failing, and their commanders were becoming unpredictable. Vance turned to his staff. Prepare Phase 4. One of the officers looked surprised. Already? Yes. The officer nodded. What are your orders? Vance looked toward the stars. For days, we have been removing the Creel war machine piece by piece. Now, he paused. Now we let them realize the truth. The officer frowned. What truth? Vance activated a new signal. Across the sector, dozens of hidden human ships began broadcasting a message on every military channel the Creel fleet used. Moments later, Admiral Craven's communication officer spoke urgently. Admiral, We are receiving a transmission. Craven turned. From who? The officer looked confused. It appears to be from humans. Craven's eyes narrowed. Put on the main screen. The image appeared. Admiral Elias Vance stood calmly on the display. He looked directly at the Creel commander. Admiral Craven. Vance said quietly, "This is Admiral Elias Vance of the Human Systems Union." Craven bared his teeth. "You dare contact me while sabotaging my fleet?" Vance remained calm. "For the past 3 days, your fleet has been operating without its supply network." Craven's anger grew. "What is your point, human?" Vance's voice remained steady. "My point, Admiral," he paused, "is that your fleet no longer has enough fuel to reach Torren Gate." The bridge of the Creel flagship fell silent. Craven slowly turned toward his navigation officer. The officer looked down. "Admiral, our fuel reserves confirm a human calculation." Craven's claws tightened. The humans had allowed his fleet to travel deep into the sector, and now they were stranded. Vance continued speaking. "You are now 3 days away from your nearest operational supply station. Your communications with your empire are down, and your fleet cannot retreat." Craven stared at the screen with pure hatred. "What do you want?" Vance answered calmly. "Nothing." Then he added something that made every Creel officer freeze. "We only wanted you to understand that the war you believe you controlled was never yours. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the Creel fleet, new human fleets were beginning to arrive." To be continued. For a long moment, the bridge of the Creel flagship was completely silent. Admiral Craven stood frozen in front of the giant screen where Admiral Elias Vance had just delivered his message. The calm voice of the human commander still echoed inside the bridge. "Your fleet cannot retreat." Those words burned inside Craven's mind. He slowly turned toward his navigation officers. "Confirm the fuel calculations again," he ordered. The officer quickly checked the numbers on his console. His hands trembled slightly. "Admiral, the human message is correct." Craven's eyes narrowed. "Explain." The officer swallowed. "Our fleet pushed engines beyond standard limits during the last 2 days. Without the scheduled fuel resupply from our outer stations, we have enough reserves for approximately 36 hours of combat movement." Craven stared at the star map. Torren Gate was still more than 40 hours away. His fleet could not reach it. Another officer spoke quietly. "Admiral, if we continue forward, the fleet will stop before reaching the gate." Craven's claws tightened around the command rail. "And retreat?" The officer hesitated. "With current reserves, retreat is also impossible." The bridge became silent again. The great Creel War fleet had marched proudly into enemy space, but now they were trapped inside it. Craven looked back at the screen where the human admiral had appeared. The human had not threatened him. The human had not demanded surrender. He had simply revealed the truth. And that truth was worse than any weapon. Far away, on the human command ship HSS Resolute, Admiral Elias Vance watched the Creel fleet through a quiet tactical display. Around him, human officers studied incoming reports from hundreds of small operation teams spread across the sector. Commander Lena Ortiz's voice appeared through the communication channel. "Admiral, mining station shutdown confirmed. All Phase 3 objectives are complete." Vance nodded. "Well done, Commander." Another officer approached him. "Admiral, the Creel fleet has stopped accelerating. Their speed is dropping." Vance looked at the map. The massive red fleet was still moving, but the change was obvious. They were conserving fuel now. "They have realized the situation," Vance said calmly. One of the younger officers looked curious. "Sir, if they cannot reach Torren Gate and cannot retreat, what will they do?" Vance folded his hands behind his back. "They will attempt something desperate." "What kind of desperate action?" The Admiral looked at the star map again. "Either they attack immediately, or they search for new fuel sources." The officer frowned. "Fuel sources?" "Yes," Vance replied. "There are several small mining colonies in the sector. They may attempt to capture them." Another officer spoke. "That would buy them time." Vance nodded slightly. "But not enough." At that moment, the sensor officer suddenly turned toward the Admiral. "Sir, Multiple Creel ships are breaking formation. Vance raised an eyebrow. Show me. The holographic map zoomed in. Several Creel battle groups were leaving the main fleet. They were heading toward nearby star systems. Commander Ortiz's voice returned over the channel. Admiral, they are searching for fuel. Vance gave a small smile. Exactly as expected. But then he said something surprising. Do not stop them. The officers looked confused. Sir, allow them to capture those stations, Vance continued. The room fell silent. One officer finally asked the obvious question. But, Admiral, that will allow them to continue the attack. Vance shook his head slowly. No. He pointed to the star map. They believe those stations still contain usable fuel. The officers studied the map carefully. Then one of them slowly realized something. The stations had already been visited by human operations teams. The fuel inside them was no longer usable. But the Creel fleet did not know that. Vance spoke quietly. They will waste their remaining time chasing resources that no longer exist. Inside the Creel fleet, the situation was becoming chaotic. Admiral Craven watched the commanders argue across the command network. Some demanded immediate attack. Others insisted the fleet must find fuel first. Craven finally silenced them all. We will secure new resources. He turned toward the navigation officer. Identify the nearest mining colonies. The officer quickly scanned the star charts. 3 systems within range, Admiral. Send battle groups to all of them. Yes, Admiral. Moments later, Creel warships separated from the main fleet and rushed toward the nearby colonies. If they could capture fuel, they might still reach Torren Gate. Craven stood silently as the ships disappeared into the darkness. But something about the situation still felt wrong. The humans had predicted everything so far. What if this was also part of their plan? Craven growled quietly. No, humans cannot control everything. Several hours later, the first Creel battle group reached the Loras mining colony. The colony was small. Only a few hundred workers lived there. Most were civilians from neutral systems. As the Creel ships entered orbit, panic spread through the colony. Emergency sirens echoed across the mining platforms. The Creel commander opened a communication channel. This colony is now under the authority of the Creel Dominion, he announced coldly. All fuel reserves will be transferred to our fleet immediately. The terrified station administrator quickly obeyed. But when the Creel engineers began transferring the fuel, something strange happened. Their instruments started showing errors. One of the engineers reported to the commander, Sir, the fuel reserves appear contaminated. The commander frowned. Explain. The molecular structure is unstable. It cannot be used safely by our engines. The commander growled. Test another tank. The engineers checked again. Then again. Every storage tank gave the same result. The fuel had been altered, completely useless. The commander immediately sent a message back to Admiral Craven. On the Creel flagship, the report arrived within minutes. Craven listened silently as the message played. Fuel reserves unusable. Mining colony empty of resources. Craven's eyes slowly widened. Humans? They had already visited the colony. They had not destroyed it. They had simply made its resources worthless. Another message arrived from a second battle group. The same result. And then a third. Every station the Creel tried to capture had already been neutralized. Craven slammed his claw against the command console. They planned everything. His officers remained silent. The truth was now obvious. The humans had studied the sector for years. They knew every supply station, every mining colony, every possible escape route, and they had quietly prepared them all. Craven looked at the star map again. His fleet was now stranded in enemy space. Fuel reserves almost empty. Supply stations useless. Communication lines broken. For the first time in his life, Admiral Craven realized something terrifying. The Creel Dominion was not fighting a battle. They were trapped inside a human strategy. Back on the human command ship, Admiral Vance received the final reports. Commander Ortiz spoke calmly. All targeted stations have been secured. Admiral, the Creel fleet has no remaining fuel sources in the sector. Vance nodded. Well done. The officers around him watched the star map. The massive Creel fleet was still drifting through space. But now they were running out of time. One officer asked quietly, "Admiral, what happens next?" Vance looked toward the distant stars. "For the last 4 days, we allowed the Creel fleet to move deeper into this sector. Now they understand they cannot advance. They cannot retreat. They cannot resupply." The officer waited. "So what will they do?" Vance answered calmly. "They will finally do the only thing they have left." "What is that?" Vance looked at the map again. "They will fight." At that exact moment, the sensors detected something new. The Creel fleet was reorganizing. All remaining ships were moving into a single massive formation. The desperate fleet was preparing for one final attack. And this time, they were heading directly toward the human fleet. The trapped army had decided to gamble everything. To be continued. The stars around the Oridan sector looked quiet. But every command center in the region knew that something historic was about to happen. For 4 days, the Creel Dominion fleet had marched proudly through the sector. They had believed they were unstoppable. They believed the war would end with another victory. Now everything was different. The fleet that once looked like a powerful invasion force was now a desperate army. Fuel reserves were almost gone. Supply lines had disappeared. Communication with the Creel Empire had been cut. And now the entire fleet was moving toward a single destination, the human fleet. Inside the Creel flagship Blood of Conquest, Admiral Craven stood like a statue in front of the star map. Hundreds of Creel warships were forming a massive attack formation. It was their final gamble. One officer spoke carefully. "Admiral, our ships report fuel levels falling rapidly. Many vessels can only operate their engines for another 10 hours. Craven nodded slowly. "That will be enough." Another officer looked confused. "Admiral?" Craven pointed at the map. "The humans believe they have trapped us." His yellow eyes burned with cold determination. "Then we will turn the trap into a battlefield." The officers listened carefully. Craven continued. "If we destroy the human command fleet, the Valoran defenses will collapse. And once Torin Gate falls, the rest of the sector will belong to the Dominion." The officer hesitated. "But Admiral, our fleet is exhausted." Craven looked directly at him. "So are they?" The order was given. The Creel fleet accelerated toward the human formation. Their final charge had begun. Far away, the human command ship HSS Resolute floated quietly near a distant blue star. Admiral Elias Vance stood beside the tactical display. Around him, dozens of human officers watched the approaching Creel fleet. A young officer spoke. "Admiral, the Creel fleet is committing to a direct attack." Vance nodded calmly. "Yes." Another officer looked slightly nervous. "They still outnumber our ships." "That is correct." "Then why are we allowing them to approach?" Vance looked toward the stars outside the window. "Because the battle they want is not the battle we prepared." He turned back to the tactical display. "Signal all fleets." The officer quickly transmitted the command. Across the sector, hundreds of human ships began moving, but they were not forming a traditional battle line. Instead, they spread across a wide area of space. Large carriers moved slowly backward. Small maneuver ships drifted toward nearby asteroid fields. Strange modular structures began activating energy arrays. The human fleet looked less like an army and more like a network. Commander Lena Ortiz's voice appeared through the communication channel. "Admiral, all control points are ready." Vance nodded. "Begin activation." As the Creel fleet approached, their sensors suddenly detected something strange. Admiral Craven stared at the tactical screen. "What is happening?" His sensor officer looked confused. Unknown energy signatures appearing across the system. Craven leaned closer. "Explain." The officer pointed at the display. "Multiple human devices are activating near the asteroid fields, near the star, and near several planets." Craven's eyes narrowed. Then the answer became clear. "Gravitational anchors," he whispered. The humans were not preparing a simple battle. They were reshaping the battlefield itself. Across the entire star system, hidden human technology began activating. Massive gravitational generators pulled nearby asteroid clusters into slow-moving defensive walls. Energy grids formed around key locations. Navigation routes shifted as gravitational currents changed. Within minutes, the entire star system became a complex maze. The Creel fleet suddenly found itself flying through unstable space. Their formation began to break apart. Navigation officers shouted warnings. Admiral, asteroid field movement detected. Energy barriers forming ahead. Gravitational fluctuations affecting engine stability. Craven slammed his claws against the console. Hold formation. But it was impossible. The human battlefield had turned the star system itself into a weapon. On the HSS Resolute, Admiral Vance watched the results calmly. The tactical display showed Creel ships struggling to maintain formation. Their fleet was powerful, but power meant little when the battlefield itself was controlled by the enemy. One officer spoke quietly. Admiral, the Creel fleet is losing coordination. Vance nodded. They train for fleet battles, not for environmental warfare. Commander Ortiz reported again. Phase 4 complete, Admiral. Vance gave the next order. Begin Phase 5. The officer looked curious. Engagement. Vance shook his head slightly. No. Isolation. Small groups of human ships began moving through the unstable battlefield. Instead of attacking the entire Creel fleet, they targeted individual clusters of ships. Each group of Creel vessels became separated from the others by moving asteroid fields and shifting gravity currents. The once massive invasion fleet slowly broke apart. One battle group drifted near a dense asteroid cloud. Another group struggled inside an unstable gravity pocket. Communication between them became chaotic. Craven watched his once perfect formation dissolve. Human strategy, he growled. They were not fighting his fleet directly. They were dividing it, turning one giant army into dozens of isolated battles. Craven turned to his officers. Reform the fleet. But the response came quickly. Admiral gravitational interference prevents regrouping. Craven's eyes burned with frustration. For the first time, he truly understood the human strategy. They had not simply cut his supply lines. They had not simply trapped his fleet. They had prepared an entire battlefield designed specifically to defeat it. Hours passed. One by one, Creel ships lost power as their fuel reserves reached zero. Some vessels drifted helplessly. Others attempted desperate attacks against nearby human ships. But without coordination, the once terrifying Dominion fleet became scattered fragments. Inside the Blood of Conquest, alarms echoed across the bridge. Admiral reactor fuel reserves critical. Craven stared at the darkening star map. Hundreds of Creel ships were now disabled. Others were surrendering. Some had already been captured. Craven slowly understood the truth. The battle had never been about destroying the Creel fleet. It had been about ending the war. He looked at the screen where Admiral Vance appeared again. The human commander spoke calmly. Admiral Craven. Craven did not respond. Vance continued. Your fleet is out of fuel. Your communication network is gone. Craven remained silent. For 5 days, Vance said, humanity has demonstrated something important. Craven finally spoke. What? Vance answered quietly. That war is not won by the strongest weapon. It is won by understanding the system that creates the war. Craven stared at the screen. The Creel Dominion had built their empire on strength and fear, but humans had fought the war in a completely different way. Not through destruction, through control. Craven lowered his head slightly. For the first time, the Creel warlord accepted the truth. We were invited into the wrong war, he said quietly. Admiral Vance gave a small nod. Yes. Craven slowly shut down the engines of the Blood of Conquest. Across the battlefield, hundreds of Creel ships did the same. The war in the Oridan sector was over. Days later, the Galactic Council gathered again under the Great Glass Dome. News of the battle had spread across the entire galaxy. The Creel Dominion fleet had been defeated without a single massive fleet battle. Entire empires struggled to understand what had happened. Ambassador Rilen looked at the final report and whispered quietly, humans did not just win the war. They changed how wars are fought. Far away, Admiral Elias Vance stood again beside the window of the HSS Resolute, looking at the stars. One of his officers approached. "Admiral, the Council has sent a message." Vance turned. "What do they want?" The officer smiled slightly. "They want to know how humanity won so quickly." Vance looked back at the stars. Then he gave the same quiet answer he had given before. "Because we were not fighting their fleet." He paused. "We were fighting the war itself." And across the galaxy, one lesson spread quickly. Inviting humanity into a war could become the worst mistake in galactic history.